My name is Dr. Amishi, and I am the Director of Contemplative Neuroscience for the Mindfulness Research and Practice Initiative and an Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Miami. I'm a neuroscientist and I study attention in my lab at the University of Miami. We spoke last about the brain's attention system, how it's an incredibly powerful system, how it's vulnerable by things like stress, poor mood, and threat, and also the hope and promise of its trainability through mindfulness meditation training. So let's do a little bit of a time traveling back. I want you to picture in your mind a scene. And the scene is from 100 years ago. Imagine yourself walking down the street when there were very few cars and lots of bicycles and people walking and moving around. Now for somebody from 100 years ago, the idea that you'd get on a bicycle that's had its back wheel removed to pedal as hard and fast as you can for, let's say, 30 minutes at a time to get absolutely nowhere, it would have sounded preposterous. Nobody would do this, right? If you saw somebody running down the street, you'd be concerned. You'd think they were being chased, maybe by a bear, or that they were running from a fire. Seeing people taking a spinning class or jogging was just not common. And I'm mentioning this because I want us to really get a sense of how new these activities are. And I actually want to ask you a question, which is this: does physical activity improve physical well-being? I think all of you listening to my voice would say, absolutely. What a strange question. It's obvious that physical activity is necessary for our physical fitness and for our physical health, right? But we didn't always have this view. Even 100 years ago, we didn't have this view. So what is it that leads us to this very common cultural understanding? Now, as a scientist, I'm very proud to say that it's research. It's dedicated research over decades. In fact, since 1980, there have been 300,000 articles published on the relationship between physical exercise, physical activity, and physical health. And if we think about this literature, it's been parsed in particular ways. One way that this literature has explored this topic is by bringing people in who are very physically active. Think about bringing in athletes into a laboratory and then looking at their physiology while they're exercising. You might look at their heart rate or their respiration rate to really get a sense of what their physiology looks like relative to people that are sedentary, for example. And we would notice differences that suggest that there are markers for good health. Or you could bring in people that are physically very active and just have them rest. Look at their baseline physiology to see if it differs from people that aren't physically active. Or for more of the everyday experience, take people that aren't all that active, train them, have them engage in a regular routine of physical activity and see how the structure and functioning of their body differs. Does it look more in the direction of physical health? These are all just windows in to understanding this relationship between physical activity and physical health. And probably the most common way of looking at the benefits of physical activity are to look at performance. Whether it's couch to 5K or training for a half marathon or a marathon, the act of regularly engaging in this type of activity may lead to performance benefits when you try to engage in it. So why am I mentioning all of this? I'm mentioning it to say that our common cultural understanding about this comes from research. And we're now at the point, thankfully, where our public health officials and policymakers can give us precise, evidence-based guidance on what to do daily to stay physically active and physically fit. So that's the state of affairs when it comes to the physical body's well-being. Now let's shift gears to thinking about the mind. What if I asked you a very similar question? Does mental activity help our psychological well-being? I think if you're listening to me and tuned into this, you probably would answer yes. I'm not actually saying something that you don't already probably think. But if I probed a little deeper and asked you specifically what you should do, I think we're going to have a lot more diversity of opinion. So the reason I asked us to take this little bit of historical journey to understand where we're at with regard to our awareness of the importance of physical fitness for physical health and the parallel of mental exercise for psychological well-being is because in the work that I pursue in my laboratory, we really think about mindfulness training as a form of cognitive training. And we see it as potentially a very useful tool by which to build our own psychological capacities, our well-being, our resilience, as well as our ability to perform and engage with the challenges that we experience in our day-to-day lives. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that there is a very strong parallel between the mind and the body. Now, as I said, we all understand that the body needs daily exercise to stay physically fit. The mind, the brain are very much similar. We need daily mental exercise to stay psychologically fit and cognitively capable. The question is what that exercise routine should be. And this is where mindfulness training is really entering the landscape with a lot of force and a lot of promise. So what I'd like to do next is actually go back to the foundational topic that we're talking about here, attention, and describe to you how it is that attention works so we can begin exploring its trainability. So as I've already said to you, attention is a very powerful and complex brain system. It does a lot of different things that we need in order to be successful in our behavior in the world. But to really understand and study this brain system, and also to understand differences between what it is that it does, it's been broken down or fractionated into three main subsystems. And to help us understand what these are, I'm going to give you a little bit of a metaphor for each of these so you can really grasp what the concept is here and how attention can have multiple varieties and many formats. So the first subsystem of attention, something we formally call the brain's orienting system, I would say think of it as the metaphor of the flashlight. So what do we know about a flashlight? If you're in a darkened room and you need information to maybe make your way to a certain part of the room, a flashlight's very helpful. Wherever it is that that flashlight is pointing, you'll get more information from. So this is exactly the way the brain's orienting system works. Wherever it is that the brain's orienting system points allows you to have more information from that part of space, for example, in the visual environment. But the attentional flashlight is not limited to the visual world. We can actually have sort of orienting in our auditory processing as well, listening for certain kinds of sounds, for example, or a familiar voice, it might be. And it's not even in the physical environment that we can think about the brain's orienting system working. We can point that flashlight to the internal environment, to thoughts, experiences, memories that we've had. So for example, if I asked you to remember what you had for your last meal, what did you just do there? You actually took that flashlight of attention and directed it to your long-term memory to bring forward all the information tied to the last meal. You might remember what it was, what it tasted like, if you enjoyed it or not. All that came about because you directed that internal flashlight to memory. This just gives you a sense of the importance of the brain's orienting system. We need it to select information not only from the environment, but from our own mind. But in contrast to this view of a flashlight and attentional orienting, let's think of another metaphor for attention. This time I want you to think of attention, specifically the brain's alerting system, sort of like a yellow traffic light. So if you're driving and you see a flashing yellow light, what does it signal to you? It means be cautious, be alert, be aware. But it's not providing you with specific information on what it is that you should be looking for. It could be children playing in the street or animals or a strange traffic pattern. It could be anything. So essentially what a yellow flashing traffic light means is keep your attention at the ready. Be ready to deploy it as soon as it may be needed. But it's very non-specific regarding what it is that you pay attention to. So whereas the flashlight allowed us to narrow, the alerting system, this yellow traffic light, is actually encouraging our attention to be very broad and receptive to all that might be happening. I think that these two are quite different from each other, and hopefully these metaphors will help you understand that. But there is yet a third way in which attention works. And the metaphor I like to use for this is that of a juggler, right? This is the brain's executive system. And we use that term executive because it's very much like the executive of a company. The job of the executive in a company, for example, is to ensure that all of the behaviors of different employees, for example, aligns with the goals that are needed to achieve. In some sense, you might say it's keeping all the balls in the air of the juggler. The executive system is not doing the individual tasks, but it's overseeing and ensuring that there's alignment between goals and action. So the brain's executive attention system, or the juggler, is very different from the flashlight or the yellow traffic light, right? Its job is quite distinct in that it has to ensure that behavior and goals align. So now we've discussed how these different attention systems work and how in many ways they have complementary functions, right? Not the same function, but they're all needed to work in coordination for complex behavior. Now I'd like to switch gears to discuss how it is that these attention systems can actually not serve us and can become compromised in the context of psychological disorders. So let's talk first about the orienting system. One very common and unfortunately prevalent psychological disorder tied to dysfunction of the orienting system is depression. We can think of depression as essentially the brain's flashlight getting stuck on depressogenic or negative thoughts. And in some ways, this can become problematic for our ongoing mood and our capacity to function if that's all that happens to our attention system. Many people describe this as attentional rubbernecking, where we know that there are other materials and other experiences to focus on, but we somehow keep getting yanked back there. Now, when we think about the alerting system and that yellow flashing traffic light, it's actually related to disorders like anxiety and PTSD. In the examples of these particular psychological illnesses, everything sort of feels like a yellow flashing light. Everything leaves us on alert and makes us hypervigilant about what's happening. Unfortunately, when this happens, it compromises our ability to function in the world when we become so vigilant, hypervigilant, and can't actually function normally. And finally, when we think about disorders of the central executive or the executive attention system, we're talking about a juggler who keeps dropping the ball. These are examples of people that suffer from attention deficit disorder or ADD and ADHD. In those cases, we can think of having an overly rambunctious juggler so that goals and behavior are not aligned. Now, I'm bringing all three of these disorders up: depression, anxiety and PTSD, for example, and ADHD, because they give us a sense of how it is that our psychological health and the cognitive functioning of our attention system are completely intertwined. Many people want to say that the heart and the mind are actually distinct, but I hope you're getting the sense that these are incredibly integrated and interrelated, which also means that if we can train our attention system to be more focused, to be better able to notice, and to get on track when we want it to be, we will not only help our ability to perform in the world, but we may also have a chance to improve our psychological well-being. Unfortunately, one thing is true. The chances of our attention system not working right increase under stress. And I mentioned this in the first session. Stress, poor mood, and threat are the top three vulnerabilities of our attention system. The metaphor I want to use here is of an MP3 player. Very simple. You know what this looks like. We've got play and pause, fast forward, and reverse. So the mind is fantastic at mental time travel using this MP3 player metaphor, right? We know we can very easily rewind the mind. We can reflect on past experiences. We can productively think about what we've done in the past to plan for the future. So rewind is a very easy, seamless function we all engage in often to help us maneuver in the world. We also know that our mind can very easily fast forward to future events, to plan for the next thing we may want to do. And we also seamlessly go back and forth, where we rewind, fast forward, rewind, and fast forward. Sometimes we might do this without even being aware that we've landed in the past or we're on to the future. Now, in those moments, we're actually using our attention productively. We might not even land in the fast forward or reverse on purpose, but it's helpful to us in what we want to do. Under high stress, though, we tend to do this kind of mental time traveling much more frequently, and when we do it, it's not productive. Under high stress, when we rewind the mind, it's not just to productively reflect, but we end up ruminating, reliving over and over again events that have already happened. And when we fast forward, we're not productively planning, but we're actually catastrophizing or worrying about events that frankly haven't happened yet and may never happen. So this is where our attention essentially becomes hijacked by mental time travel. And I'm mentioning this because it relates to a very important concept that probably is one of the central vulnerabilities of our attention and our ability to actually be present in our lives, something called mind wandering. Now, that might not sound like a very technical term, but actually it is. In my field as a psychologist, a cognitive neuroscientist, mind wandering refers to having off-task thoughts during an ongoing task or activity. Let me make sure you get that. Having off-task thoughts during an ongoing task or activity, right? So you have a task at hand. You have something you want to do, but the mind is not aligned with that. It's actually somewhere else. Attention has been hijacked away from the task at hand. Now, why is mind wandering so problematic? Well, first and foremost, you need your attention to do the job that you want to do. Whether it's to read a book, have a conversation, whatever it is, you need your attention in order to do it. So if your attention is hijacked away, you're not going to have many cognitive resources available to you to engage productively in that task. Now, when we study mind wandering in simple experiments in the laboratory, we learn a lot about the costs of this particular type of mental activity. What we learn first is that it compromises performance on the task at hand. People just don't perform it well in what you want them to do. We also know that the mind suffers from something called perceptual decoupling. So that's, again, another bit of a jargony term, but let me describe to you what that means. When your mind is wandering, your ability to perceive information is compromised. And again, within several hundred milliseconds of information happening. Think of it this way, you're just not hearing sounds as clearly, you're not seeing visual information as predominantly. You are compromised in your ability to gain access to your environment. Now, you can imagine that for somebody like a firefighter or a first responder, a police officer, or a military service member, or even somebody that's a TSA agent screening baggage, if they're mind wandering, they're not able to perceive what's in front of them, and that could have, unfortunately, life or death consequences. But I would say mind wandering is a concern for all of us because we want to productively be able to do what we want to do. In addition to performance challenges and perceptual decoupling, a third consequence of mind wandering is poor mood. In fact, one of the most popular papers on this topic was entitled, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind" by some colleagues at Harvard. What does this actually mean? It means that if you mind wander, the chances of your mood being poor in the next moment are greater. That's a problem. So not only will you suffer from bad performance, but your mood may also be compromised with mind wandering. Let me make an important distinction here, because a lot of times when I describe mind wandering, I get pushback, which is I have some of my best, most creative thoughts when I let my mind wander. And I would say that's not mind wandering. So when we talk about mind wandering, again, I said it twice, it's having off-task thoughts during an ongoing task or activity. There's a goal, a task, and your mind is not there, right? But there's another way in which the mind can wander, if you want to talk about it that way, where there's the free flow of conscious thought bubbling up as it will spontaneously. In psychology speak, we don't call that mind wandering. We call that conscious internal reflection. Very technical. But this would be episodes when you decide to go for a walk and just let your mind drift to where it will. Conscious internal reflection, or daydreaming as we might call it, is very helpful. It helps us get creative, have more positive mood, problem solve with more ease, and it benefits our sense of satisfaction and fullness in our lives. We don't want to miss the opportunity to daydream in that way. But be very clear that this is distinct from mind wandering and the problematic nature that it causes for attention. I want to make a point here for this week's exercise. In our 24/7 technology-driven world, we actually seem to be compromising our moments of daydreaming or spontaneous internal reflection. We saturate our attention with the next thing on our screen while we're scrolling, or what we see on various media formats, and we never really let it wander freely. So I want you to really pay attention again to where your attention goes and give back some more moments of this free-flowing, generative, positive way in which you can make your attention more productive and beneficial for yourself by letting your thoughts just wander where they will.